Meanwhile, while all that's going on, he's overseeing a lot of domestic reforms. Again, it's very complicated to explain in great detail, but a number of the law courts which Wolsey establishes, the Court of Requests, the Court of Poor Man's Causes, and the use of the Royal Council sitting as a judicial body, as Star Chamber. These are all ways in which Wolsey is seen as helping to do two things really. His critics say that he's feathering his own nest and he's trying to build up a power base within, on the legal side for himself, which was probably true, or true enough. Those who are more supportive say that he's genuinely trying to make the King's justice work as efficiently as it possibly can, given the constraints under which it operates. So that's the debate which historians have engaged in. You might like to read the work of John Guy, for example, who in his early part of his career did a lot of work on Wolsey and the judiciary and Star Chamber and the Royal Council. And so that's another aspect of Wolsey. Wolsey is also Henry's chief parliamentary manager, so the various sessions of Parliament, voting taxation, voting subsidies for war and so on, all of that is under Wolsey's direction as well. And he also introduces quite significant reforms to the parliamentary taxation system to make it better reflect the actual wealth of the realm through taxation by what they call subsidy, which is voted for by Parliament, rather than supplementing the older form of taxation known as tenths and fifteenths, which didn't really any longer reflect the actual wealth which people had. And again, Wolsey has his critics for that. He's also very keen to ensure that there are no what were known in the 15th and early 16th century as over-mighty subjects, people who might challenge the power and authority of the king, as had happened during the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. So he works very closely with the king with that, with appointing magistrates and JPs in the localities, supervising the workings of the judicial system, and I suppose the such control as the Tudor state did manage to have over people in the localities tended to be concentrated in areas where that was easiest, around London and the southeast, etc. So he does a lot of things which people talk about Thomas Cromwell later being involved in doing, in improving, streamlining Tudor administration. Wolsey was also involved in his own way doing that sort of thing as well. So on the religious side, or on the ecclesiastical front, on the legal and administrative front, and in foreign affairs, Wolsey is the prime man for Henry, and that's why it's a very close and important relationship. And there's very few letters which Henry VIII wrote with his own hand, but one of them is written to Wolsey, and he describes that, Henry describes how writing to him is, quote, somewhat tedious and painful. So when you write a letter, then it's a fairly special thing. And I'm aware of two that survive from Henry to Wolsey, that one I've just referred to, and another one in which he talks about Wolsey referring certain decisions to him. He sent a messenger asking the king what the king wants to do in a number of particular circumstances, and Henry just replies, "I'm quite happy with whatever you decide to do." So clearly Henry reposes a lot of trust in Wolsey, and for good reason, because from 1512 onwards Wolsey doesn't really put a foot wrong. There are occasional squabbles and occasional decisions which the king doesn't like. That's what makes Henry a tricky master to serve. His whole point, Wolsey's whole point at the start of Henry's reign, was to free the king from all this tedious business of administration which he didn't like, to allow him to indulge in his favourite pleasures such as hunting, being with his friends, having banquets, and of course eventually going to war and things, or parading himself on the international stage, receiving embassies and that sort of thing. That's what Henry liked doing, and Wolsey was perfectly happy to help him do that. But equally, Henry could, without warning, suddenly come back on something, suddenly intervene, put his finger on a page and say what's going on here. So Wolsey had to be very careful the way he handled Henry. He was also separated from the king quite a lot, and some historians, particularly David Starkey, for example, talking about the court, has emphasised the fact that Wolsey and the king, although they have this close relationship, they're not always physically close to each other. Because Wolsey is very much in charge of the administration, he's centred very much on Westminster Hall, where the judges of the King's Bench meet, where the Royal Council is, and so he's not always with the King. The King is meanwhile out on one of his hunting trips, or often down at Greenwich. Henry doesn't have a palace in central London between about 1512 and Wolsey's fall, in fact, in 1529, because there was a fire in the Palace of Westminster and the royal apartments were never rebuilt. So Henry actually lives most of the time down at Greenwich, or sometimes at Richmond, and people go to him. They commute up and down the river. Sometimes if Henry has to be in London or in Westminster for a particular activity, then he'll come up from wherever he is, but most often people go to him, including Wolsey. And Wolsey used to go down there once a week or so, usually on a Sunday, and explain to the King what he'd been doing, give him a report of what things had been going on, and then he'd sort of sail back up to his place at Hampton Court, and that's how it sort of worked. So all of this is really about the reasons why Wolsey rises to power and continues at the height of his power for as long as he does. And to my mind, the answer is really very simple. His competence, his ambition, is matched with a competence on details as well as a vision of seeing possibilities and seeing resolutions to problems which the King has, or initiatives to help the King achieve the aims that he has. This is what keeps Wolsey, and nobody else can match him for this. And he tries to make sure that is the case. My point about the King and the Cardinal being separated is that one thing which Wolsey very much fears is the influence of courtiers who might be close to Henry and who he can't control. In 1526 he brings out a series of ordinances which were published at a house which he used at Eltham, the palace in fact where Henry spent his childhood, the Eltham Ordinances, which really tried to restrict the numbers of people who could see the King, tried to stop them doing the sorts of things that courtiers will do, ask for favours, try and do favours for each other, try and get the King to give them rewards or get them lucrative offices for themselves, their family or their friends. Wolsey wants to have total control of that, and for the most part he has a fairly large control of it, but not complete. And he's always worried if people, like these mythical creatures, well, they're not mythical, they really do exist, but they've become important in Tudor historiography, the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. These men who are close with the King, who are with him every day, who hunt with him, who dress him in the morning, help him to get into bed in the evening. These people are the ones that Wolsey's not very happy with. And of course it's from them, or among them, that the real danger towards the end of Wolsey's career begins to emerge. And that is, of course, the person of Anne Boleyn. And really, Wolsey's fall, without wishing to be simplistic, you could argue that Wolsey's fall is as simple as his rise. In 1529, he can't do what he's been doing for the best part of 2 decades beforehand, and that is give the King what he wants. The King wants his marriage annulled. And that's it. There's nothing that Wolsey can do, because he's a fairly conventional churchman, but there's nothing that he can do in the very complicated international circumstances which he faces to bring that about. The Pope is not going to give the King an annulment, because to do so would be to offend Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose troops are in control of Rome. Clement VII is a member of the Medici family. His relatives in Florence also depend upon him to keep them in power in Florence, and therefore he can't step out of line with the Emperor. And the Emperor doesn't want anything done that will bring insult to a member of his family, his aunt, Catherine of Aragon, the wife of Henry VIII. And so, and Wolsey tries all kinds of ways, alliances with the King of France, getting the French King to send cardinals to Rome to try and plead the case, even at one point a suggestion that he'll become a sort of acting pope in Europe while Clement is indisposed. All of that comes to absolutely nothing. And finally, in 1529, when there's this trial about the King's marriage, the Legatine Court at Blackfriars, where Cardinal Campeggio comes from Rome, and Wolsey is there, the 2 cardinals sitting, supposedly presiding over this question of the King's marriage, but with Campeggio being told by the Pope not to allow anything to happen. Wolsey has no answer. When Catherine stands up and refuses to recognise the legatine court and appeals directly to Rome, there is just nothing Wolsey can do. And not only does Wolsey know that, but so do the people who are around him and around the king. Wolsey, his ways of going about things at times did get people's backs up, and he was a man from fairly humble origins, which the nobles and the upper gentry who were around the king never forgot and never forgave him for. So they were probably always looking for ways to do him down, and in Anne Boleyn, without getting into the debate as to how much she did or didn't drive all of this, in Anne Boleyn there was a person who in a sense displaced Wolsey. By some would argue as early as 1527, certainly by 1528 and 29, at least on the question of the annulment, Henry is not listening to Wolsey as he once did. He's listening to other people who are beginning to suggest other ways of solving the problem. So, and eventually, when that legatine court fails, the game is up for Wolsey, and he's forced to give up the Great Seal, which he holds as Lord Chancellor, and he's sent up to his archbishopric in York, but he's not there very long before he's arrested and charged with high treason, and was being brought back down to London to face trial and, one imagines, almost certain death, when he in fact died of natural causes at Leicester Abbey. So it's, without being simplistic, in a sense the answer is as to why Wolsey rises and why he falls is simple. It's its relationship with Henry, it's what it gives Wolsey, and what Wolsey is able to give Henry, seemingly without any problem, for year after year after year, that explains his rise and his success and all that flows from that for Wolsey. Similarly, it's when Wolsey finally comes up with an insurmountable problem that, for all his imagination and trickery, he can't get around. That is when he loses the king's favour definitively, because it's such a personal issue for the king, namely his marriage and the succession of the Tudor dynasty, and that's when Wolsey falls. So that's the rise and fall of Cardinal Wolsey.